Welcome to Coming Home, Survive and Thrive in Homeschooling. I do so enjoy interviewing people. I've interviewed parents who have homeschooled, and I've also interviewed adult homeschoolers. That is, adults who were homeschooled when they were children. And hearing both perspectives is fascinating. Today I'm talking with Lena, and I refer to listening to her mother being interviewed way back in, I think it's podcast number 13. We call her Mrs. Maths. But even putting together the perspective of Marcia versus Lena, her now adult daughter, is reassuring, encouraging, and everybody has got a story to tell, and that's what I have come to enjoy so much about interviewing people. Most of us just live very ordinary, average lives, and these are the stories that are so valuable to us. Lena's going to tell us about her track right through her schooling years and what she's doing after she finished her homeschooling. Well, officially anyway. This podcast also falls very nicely into the series that I have begun in exploring ideas that bypass university and still produce satisfying, successful careers for our teenage homeschoolers. I have said before, I have come to see it as a false measure of success, if you like, in our homeschooling, to measure how well we did as a homeschooling family by being able to say, oh, all 5 children of ours went through university. And I've talked about that before in an earlier podcast. But the way universities and in general the state schooling systems are at the moment within the Western world, it is actually a viable alternative to pave a career path by bypassing the traditional means. And this is part of a series that helps unpack the ways that we can do that. I hope you find this interview with Lena both reassuring and encouraging. I know I did. So Lena, thank you so much for saying yes as a homeschooling adult and coming to hear my questions.
You're welcome.
So can you start by telling us all, how long were you homeschooled for?
So I was homeschooled until I was about 17, I think, at which point I did horticulture through Otago Open Polytechnic and animal care through Unitec.
Oh, okay. So that was right at the end, till you were 17. When did you start?
Oh, that's a hard one. So obviously when you're very young, there's not a lot you can do. It's all games, counting how many sheep there are, that kind of thing. More formalised schoolwork, I don't think we started really until I was maybe 8 or 9, which was when we were coming up to Auckland.
Okay. Were you homeschooled before that, or did you spend some time in a state school?
Nope, homeschooled before that.
And that's interesting that you should say that you think you can remember starting like formal school, were you? So you're thinking of books and things like that when you were about 7 or 8. Because I should say to the listeners too that they can connect your feedback from homeschooling with the podcast I did when I interviewed your mother a couple of years back, because we used to refer to your mother as Mrs. Maths.
That sounds about right, yeah.
And she was also the first interview I did, so it was interesting hearing her perspective of how she got on and homeschooled you all, and now we're going to get your side of the story too, so that's really cool. So right at the end you went and studied, did you say, what was it, Otago?
Horticulture at Otago Open Polytechnic.
So was that was online, was it, not in person?
It was in person. It wasn't in Otago though. It was, one of the tutors was based in Auckland, and so the coursework was all graded down in Otago, but it was done up in Auckland.
What were you studying for?
It was to get my NCEA level 3, because I did NCEA level 1 through Te Kura Correspondence School, and basically decided I really didn't like the NCEA system. It didn't feel like it was educating me essentially, and it just felt like needlessly ticking boxes. So I thought, if I'm going to be box ticking, I might as well do something I'm interested in.
Good for you. So you moved that away from the NCEA path and you went to the Otago to get level 3. What did you need it for?
So I had no particular plans of what I wanted to do at university, but I knew, and Mum agreed, that it was a good idea to have university entrance so that if I ever did want to study at university, I would be able to. And that was also partially the reason behind animal care. I knew I was interested in animals. I didn't know specifically what field I wanted to go into, but it was a good thing to do to fill in time until I turned 18.
So after you had done that, so was that a year's course? What did that look like?
So the horticulture one was a year of part-time, and then the animal care was also a year of part-time.
So you did them both together in a year?
No, one after the other.
Oh, I see. Got you. So it was part-time. Does that mean then what were you doing on the other side of it?
So during the horticulture one, I was still, I guess you'd still call it homeschooling at home. I wasn't doing graded assessments, but I was still learning maths and writing at like a higher level than NCA level 1. And then when I was doing animal care, at that point I was working the days I wasn't at Unitec, and I also did a musical theatre show during that time, so that was one of the most busiest times of my life.
So you're kind of transitioning out really at the end of your homeschooling years, finishing off some book work of doing what was necessary and starting to move out into some working experience. Let's just talk about that one for a little while then. When you started to move out of homeschooling circles, did you start to see any differences between how you operated in life and people who, let's say, were not homeschooled? It started to kind of look like a trend or something that took you by surprise? Or could you have any comments to make along that line?
So a big one would be my faith. I was surprised by just how rare it is to meet other Christians outside of church and already established Christian circles. Another one, I think, would be just how relaxed I was about not having a plan, just kind of willing to go with the flow and see what happens.
As opposed to what?
As opposed to, I need to get this qualification so that I can get this job, so that I can be at this point in my life when I'm 25, and then at this point when I'm 30, and not having my whole life planned out.
So was that, you saw that as a common kind of way of thinking, do you mean?
Not necessarily already having it planned out, but feeling stressed thinking that they should have it all planned out.
Okay, right. Let's talk a little bit more about your homeschooling years. Looking back now, can you identify what you would call advantages to homeschooling that you weren't really aware of at the time? But looking back over your shoulder, you go,
A big one would be the flexibility. We went and lived in Vietnam for a year and a half and kept homeschooling through that. Or I was extremely interested in tropical fish. So for a solid year, all my English assessments were based around that. I would write paragraphs about this fish species or this environmental system. And I wouldn't have been able to do that in school.
How did you plan your schoolwork? Let's say you gave fish as an example. Tell us how you used your interest in fish to learn other things.
So for English, for example, a very common assignment for that day would be write a paragraph about a subject, and it needs to include these different English things. So it needs to have a sentence starting with a because, it needs to have a couple of short, sharp sentences. We had a little list of things that had to be included, and that list could change depending on what we were learning about.
What other things would you say that you were really, really interested in that your mum said, okay, well, now go and write about that?
For a while, it was policing. I wanted to be a dog handler with the police, so I wrote a few paragraphs about German Shepherd dogs and how they were trained. Or for a while, I wanted to be a paramedic, so I was very interested in first aid and medical procedures. I think that was the main interest, and other than that, there would be, Mum would still read aloud to us, or we would be reading books and she would say, write a summary of this chapter or this book.
Looking back now, you can see advantages, and we all know that there's no one perfect way to educate your children. You're going to have something happening. For you, what would you say would be a disadvantage of being homeschooled?
Possibly the consistency around extracurriculars. Especially up in Auckland, I was changing what extracurriculars I was doing quite a lot. It would be basketball or soccer or some other sport, and it would change quite a bit. Or drama, speech and drama, I think we did pretty consistently, but again, the people involved in that would change around quite a lot. Especially with what I'm doing now in stunts, I don't have the solid background of doing 12 years worth of dance or gymnastic lessons. I did a term of gymnastics, I did a couple of classes in dance and a bunch of other random things. In stunt work, a lot of it is just body control and specialization. So because I don't have a specialty, let's say, I need to learn everything from a much lower level up then say someone who has 12 years dance experience, they could learn choreo faster than I would, or someone who has gymnastics experience, they already have the body conditioning and flexibility to do some harder stretching kind of moves or contortionist kind of moves.
Tell us your story about how you've ended up doing stunt work.
So it started with doing community theatre, the speech and drama classes. I knew I loved performing, and that led to stage combat, which is sword fighting and unarmed combat for the stage. So it'd be making sounds, making it look like you're getting hit or wounded, and doing it all safely so that it looks good and everyone just has a good time. And then that led into stunt training, which is fairly similar. It's just a broader application. It's for film and TV. Lots of dying, actually. And I've still consider myself more training than working as a stunt performer, but I have started getting some small jobs for just friends' short films, a couple of YouTube channels, that kind of thing. I know it's something that I want to continue with, but in New Zealand especially, the work market is very variable. There'll be lots of work one year and then, like now, not a lot of work. So I want to keep my day job essentially, and ideally get stunt contracts that last for a couple of weeks and then back to doing my regular day job in between.
For the youngsters, or even maybe not so young, maybe into their teens that are listening and going, stunt work, how do I get into that? What would you advise them, that somebody who's interested in stunt work, to spending some time to getting better at what?
Martial arts would be a big one, or movement skills like dance or parkour or gymnastics, just anything that keeps you fit, strong and flexible and gives you control of your body so that you can have very precise movements. Or if you wanted to get into it earlier and be a very young stunt performer, if those roles come up, there's the New Zealand Stunt School. Or if you want to start with just the sword fighting and unarmed combat like I did, there's the New Zealand Stage and Screen Combat School.
If I've heard you correctly, Lena, you didn't know you wanted to be a stunt, what do you call it?
Stunt performer.
Stunt performer, until you did, with your speech and drama classes, some, what was it, a martial arts type?
Stage combat.
Stage combat. So until you did that, is that when you actually, something lit a fire in you, didn't it? And you wanted more? Even
with that, I was doing stage combat and martial arts for maybe 2-3 years before I did my first stunt course, and it was through the Stage Combat School. It was just this seems pretty cool, I'll give it a try. And it was after that first course that I was like, I want to do this is amazing. It's still a workplace if you're on set, so there's health and safety, there's regulations and all that, so you will get hurt, but it's still safe. It's like you're going to get hurt if you do sports at a high level. I've been set on fire, I've been hit by a car, I've fallen downstairs. None of those have actually hurt me that bad, just a couple of bruises really. And that was at the stunt school under supervision. Please don't try that without help.
Oh, do not try this at home.
Yeah, exactly.
Those kind of... Thank you for that disclaimer. That was well put.
Getting set on fire is not a homeschool activity.
Just clarifying there, folks.
Yeah.
With the range of stunt work now being done, what aren't you interested in doing in that?
So I'm interested in doing all of it, but for practicality, I've picked a couple of specialties that I'm really interested in, and those are what I'm going to pursue. So for instance, my flatmate is very skilled with horses and she wants to do more horse stunts, whereas I can ride a horse at a very basic level, but in order to get to a level where I could do stunts, it would take so much time and money that it would take away from the other skills that I'm more interested in. So what I want to specialise in is wire work, where you're either in a harness on wires getting pulled around or being the linesman on the other end of the wire doing the pulling.
How do you become specialised in that?
Attending all the training I can, but the thing that really is what I need and what I'm hoping to get at some point is being hired on a film set as, I think they usually call it a utility person, and then just watching the professionals who have done it a lot, watching what they do, copying them, and hopefully getting work and experience that way. It's not something you see at job fairs.
No, and it's not usually something you see promoted, let's say, during your homeschooling years either. Well, I didn't even know that it could be a career, really, so good for you. I want to go back to, you mentioned that you went to Vietnam. How old were you when you went to Vietnam?
I think I was 15 at the time, and 14 when we left, turned 15 over there.
How long were you there for?
1.5 years.
Year and a half. And what did your mum and dad, but mostly your mum, implement for you for your homeschooling while you were away? I often talk about, for instance, the world as your classroom. Mm-hmm. So rather than packing up all these textbooks and taking them with you, how did your mum implement your homeschooling while you were there?
So even before we left, we all got given a Kindle e-reader because we would need to get our books online rather than being able to go to a library. And once we were there, we took weekly classes in speaking Vietnamese. I think that was our only external class, except for my brother who did his exams at an international school. But for me and my sister, we were learning Vietnam. We would still have occasional maths or writing assessments. We were doing Mathletics at the time, the online math program. And then there were days where we just went out and experienced this amazing country and culture that we were living in.
Did you have to come back and write about your experiences?
Sometimes we would write about it, other times we didn't, and it was just, that's a memory that we have now and get to say that we experienced.
Do you have any comments on that, about how that stretched your boundaries of obviously what you were used to here?
Absolutely.
But how did that stretch your way of seeing the world and other cultures?
I think the biggest part of it was just we were undoubtedly the minority. We stuck out like sore thumbs. We were tall, we were white, we were just completely at odds with our environment around us. And even after we learned to speak a bit of Vietnamese, we were eating at all the local places. But even then, we were the minority, and we were very obviously the minority. And that is, I'm not sure a cool experience is the right word, but a very interesting experience. Seeing this entire city, this entire country where the signs aren't in English, very few people actually speak English. People are going to stare if you're walking down the street. It was very interesting.
Has it made a difference with how you view and interact with immigrants in our own country?
100%. I feel like it's a lot easier to understand their point of view. We always knew that we were living there short term. It was only going to be a year and a half. We weren't actually moving there permanently. So we could kind of cling to, yes, sometimes this is tough right now, but we're going back. Someone who moves here permanently and has to adjust, that would be a lot harder.
Let's think about some of the books that you read over the years. Now, I realise homeschoolers are given some leeways to going to choose a literature book, but I also know that we require our children to read certain books. So just cast your mind back, Lena, and think, what books did Mum say, you have to read this, and you still think it's a really, really important book?
Honestly, no. Mum did try to set assigned reading, and I would usually do it, but I really struggled to read assigned reading. I loved reading if it was something I was interested in, but a lot of the assigned reading, it was assigned because she knew if she didn't, I wouldn't read it. But also, I wouldn't say it's so much specific books you should read, it's just read everything within certain boundaries in terms of how old you are and the sexuality in the book. But my spelling was terrible, and the thing that fixed it the most was just time spent reading. Fantasy novels, non-fiction, just whatever I could get my hands on.
How has that affected the way you view books now?
So now I still love books, but I tend to use audiobooks more than physical books because I'm often on the go or at work. But it's helped me get a feel for what kind of writing style I like, and so now I can usually tell by looking at a book if I'm going to like it or not, by looking at the summary. And I know people say not to judge a book by its cover, but you can tell a lot by a cover, especially in the young adult section. So I always enjoyed reading when I was younger. It was more a case of what I enjoyed reading when I was younger was essentially pulp fiction for kids. It was the very simple format and words kind of books. I think a part of that was my spelling was still bad, so it was those simpler books that were appealing because I could more easily understand them.
Did you ever wish you could go to school?
No.
You never did? Why is that?
Because from everything I'd heard, it sounded like having to have a job. They had to get up on time every day, they had to go sit in the same building all day, and then they had to do extra work when they got home. That was in no way appealing.
Is there anything we have not talked about today that you would like to mention?
I found that in a lot of homeschool circles, which were also a lot of church circles, even when the activities were co-ed, it was kind of unspoken that there was still a separation between the genders. The girls would sit one side of the table, the boys would sit on the other side of the table. And I found, especially now that I'm older, that it wasn't very helpful for developing this ability to talk to other genders. So yes, girls and boys are different, but if you separate them, they're not going to learn how to work with those differences. They're going to view them as this other thing.
So you think it would have been better to mix them up a bit?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think it might have come from the fear that relationships would form and they would try and couple off into boyfriend-girlfriends. But I think it would have been better to let that happen and deal with that rather than having them wait until they're adults and having to have them work it out on their own at that point.
Do you think that reflects more on the particular church you choose to attend as a family, or was that also present in homeschooling classes?
So it varied quite a bit. I would say it's more to do with the churches that we went to and the youth groups. They were often very conservative churches, but even within homeschooling classes, it might have been just those are what the kids chose, but it was very much the girls are off doing dance, the boys are off doing basketball.
How do you get a balance of that happening? I was interested to hear you say that it would have been better to allow the natural boy-girl attraction to happen and then deal with that. What does that look like, Lena? How do you think adults could deal with the natural pairing up of boys and girls?
So I would say not emphasis on biology, but explaining to them what's happening in the brain of this part of your brain is developing, so this is why you're more likely to feel stronger about this boy perhaps, or even this boy has a crush on you. You don't have to do anything about it. You can continue to treat them as just a friend, and if they start acting on that crush, it is still something they have to deal with, not your problem.
So I think that's a good thing for listeners to take that on and think about how to apply that, rather than just having a total free-for-all and just let what is natural happen, or the opposite of just stop anything like that. Try and navigate this middle section here. I see it as, in principle, as being similar to television. We certainly had homeschool peers when we were homeschooling whose perspective was no television whatsoever. Nothing good can come out of it. We don't do it. To others who would say, well, we do because they've got to figure it out sometime. It's actually easier to say we're not doing television at all. But it's a lot harder to manage. Well, what kind of TV shows can you sit? That means we've got to sit down with them and explain stuff. So apply that too. Thank you for that insight. I hope that has been helpful. Let's do that very last question we've got here, Lena, where we're going to talk about what kind of advice you might be giving. One of the things I asked the parents post homeschooling, like with your mum, I said to her, if you could time travel and go backwards, what advice would you give to yourself? So it's along those lines. If you could go backwards and say to your 8-year-old self, so let's not talk about another little girl, we're going back to the 8-year-old Lena, now as an adult Lena, have you got any advice to give? And then we'll talk about you as a 15-year-old.
So when I was 8, we had just moved up from Auckland, so most of the advice would have been, don't worry, it's all going to work out. You're going to love living here.
Were you a little bit anxious about moving up here?
Oh, 100%. All my friends were in Rotorua. I didn't know anyone in Auckland. There was so much traffic. It took so long to get anywhere. We couldn't just walk down the street to the park anymore. It was very stressful.
Because even when you're 8 as a child, I can remember that too. They're real, those anxieties and stresses.
They're very big, and you don't have the life experience to know how to handle them and know that, yes, it's big, but you're still going to be okay.
So now pop yourself into teens with all of the new things of puberty and starting to look at an adult world and still being a young girl as well. So look back at your 15-year-old Lena and what advice would you give her?
So at 15, I think it was the year we moved back from Vietnam, so I was still in Vietnam when I turned 15, I think. And it would have been probably, don't worry so much about having your life planned out. Like, enjoy your interests, learn about what you find interesting, but don't try and make a career path out of it just because you think that's what you need to do. Like, university can wait. It can wait until you know what you want to do.
I've thoroughly enjoyed interviewing you today, Lena. I've known you since you were the little 8-year-old girl.
Your daughter was one of my first friends when we moved up to Auckland.
Oh, yeah, and there've been good friendships with the mums and watching you all kind of grow up together. But I've still learned some things about you today, and I think that's great. So thank you so much for being honest, no holds barred, really, the good, the bad, the ugly, everything. That's what people want to hear. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Well, now that you've heard Lena, you'll understand why I didn't give too much detail about what we were talking about in my intro. But now I can say with you afterwards what a joy it was to hear what she has said. I've known Lena since she was quite a young girl, and to see her grow up through her teenage years and into her young womanness, if you like, has been an absolute joy. And she and our youngest daughter are still best of friends, and Lena's going to be a bridesmaid for her, my youngest daughter, come next year. I really trust that this has been yet another way to encourage you in your homeschooling. As I referred to before, starting the series about how to navigate successful careers without necessarily going down the university track, I do feel that once again, homeschoolers are going to be part of a pioneer movement that forges new ways and tracks through, well, alternative paths. And I am hoping to get more interviews like this so that you too can be reassured as you are starting to help forge your teenage homeschoolers into their adulthood. That's it for us this week, and I look forward to catching up with you next time. Bye now.